Hello, everyone. Also, hello, everybody out in the lobby. I think you can hear this, and I think you're all waiting for this talk to start. So, yeah, please, corral. Uh, Welcome back. I am pleased to open up this afternoon session with our guest, K Allado-McDowell. I have been a fan of K's work from afar for a while and actually tried to get K out here last summer, but it was a little last minute, so I'm really pleased to have you with us. And Kay has been publishing in a series for the Gropius Bough this year, and the most recent piece, Neural Interpolations, I was totally struck by and informed a lot of this talk, from what I understand. And the third piece will hopefully be out this month. So without further ado, K Allado-McDowell.
Hello. I'm going to quickly introduce myself in case you don't know me. So I work with AI. I'm an artist and an AI researcher. I've published a few books. This was the first one. It came out in 2020, and it was the first book written with GPT-3. This is my second book. It's an anti-romance novel about DJ who lives in the basement of a TikTok house in Malibu and tries to find love and God in Los Angeles and fails is written also with GPT-3. And another novel I just came out with last year. My style is to collaborate in very clear ways and to make this process part of the reading experience. I've also just recently released a comic book. I wrote a script and collaborated with the artist Elon Manuik, who illustrated it with AI. It looks like we're having a little problem with the slides. While they're working with the slides, I will just also add that I work in the performing arts as well, and I have been working on an opera. We had a preview at Lincoln Center in 2022. Oh, hello, our producer from the TED version of the opera is here. And yes, we did it at TED. And we'll be doing another work with Lincoln Center next year. And that opera was a neuroscience project, and so some of my interest in what I'm calling in this talk neural media includes AI, but also extends into some of that area of neuroscience and using neuroscience to understand ourselves. I'm going to present some thoughts that were written up in this essay that Caitlin mentioned for Gropius Bough called Neural Interpolation. And the origin of some of that thinking comes from research I did when I started a program at Google in 2016 called the Artist and Machine Intelligence Program, which was created to bring artists and AI researchers into conversation and into collaboration with each other. The program launched in 2016, which was the 50-year anniversary of a program that was started at Bell Labs, called Experiments in Art and Technology, and we took quite a bit of inspiration from that program because it was one of the sort of earliest examples of a corporation bringing artists in and really committing to being experimental and to creating together. You know, at the time it was maybe not well received, but we thought perhaps this would be a good time to try that again. And in that process of researching the history of that specific program, I came across the work of a historian at Stanford named Fred Turner. Now, Fred Turner is very much interested in the history of the counterculture in California, the Bay Area, and around the world, and the history of Silicon Valley and the interweaving of these two histories. in looking at his work and the framing that he brought to the origins of the counterculture and the origins of Silicon Valley, I discovered something called the Committee for National Morale, which was created in 1939 by the Roosevelt administration. And I would love to show you some slides that are relevant to this. So let me know when I can. But this committee was formed because the US government in 1939 was, of course, in a war, this was wartime, and the US government was concerned with the way that media could control subjectivity. The reason that the piece for Gropius Bau is called neural interpolation is because this is coming from the concept of the Marxist theorist Louis Althusser. The idea of interpolation is when one is named or called, so the example is a police officer hailing someone on the street and they say, "You there," and the person on the street, if you turn around, you essentially accept the identity that's being offered to you, the identity of a criminal in that case, because a police officer is calling you. But this idea of producing subjects or creating subjects through language and media is relevant to what the committee was concerned with, which is how does broadcast media shape subjectivity? They were in particular interested in what they considered this national subjectivity. So they believed that Germans were highly susceptible to group entrainment, and in particular, broadcast media like radio and television could get people to sort of vibrate on a single frequency or to become a mass, and this would lead to totalitarianism and fascism. Now, they wanted to theorize a different kind of media that would enable independent thinking and autonomy, yes, but also control. And in their theory, they describe what we might call an influencer today, because the American subject, according to them, was very independent, did not like to be told what to do, and would only accept suggestion from their peers. So, all right. Now I'll show you all the cool pictures. Maybe. All right, okay, cool. There's my books. There's my comic. There's my opera. There's the audience. There's the neuroscience. Okay. This is what started. I don't know, has anyone seen this picture before? I love to ask people that question. Yeah. This is old school AI. AI art before anybody knew that it was even possible. This is the program I started at Google. 9 Evenings, the Bell Labs event that was inspiration for that program. And here are the documents from the Committee for National Morale. So just take note of the number of people on this committee, the radio, motion pictures, journalism, public opinion, psychiatry, neurology, everybody was thinking about this. And they were seeding a new kind of medium. And this is what Fred Turner calls eventually immersive media. And I'm gonna show you how I think that has evolved. So if this was the proposition that the committee had, essentially that broadcast media was fundamentally fascist, it would get people all to think the same thing at the same time because the message was broadcast from a single source to a mass of people all at once. And that if they wanted to create a type of media that would be more democratic, then they would need to create something that would allow more free choice and more surround and more influence from horizontal structures and peers. I created a typology kind of extending this and drawing it out a little further. I've also changed some of the terminology a little bit here, so I'll just go over this with you. But what I've done is I've looked at the history of broadcast media. The surround media that Fred Turner names, I've renamed immersive media because that feels more natural to what I think we're doing with it. Network media and neural media, which in my thinking includes AI, and anything that has a kind of neural structure to it. So that could be media that interact with our neurology, anything that's based on neuroscience, brain-computer interfaces, that type of thing. And I've kind of put these into different periods of time, and I've defined some of the properties that I see in them. And so the question that the essay asks is, how do these media types influence our production of ourselves, and what kind of subjects are they creating us to be? What are they causing us to become as they become normalized? And what were they in the past, so that we can see a sort of through line from the beginning of broadcast media to what we have now. So if we go back to broadcast media, the way I've defined it here, and just to identify, there are time periods noted. So in each of these columns, you can see a time period, 1920 to 1940. Of course, we still have broadcast media, but this is the birth of that medium, and that is what I'm focusing on. So with broadcast media, we have a centralized space with programmed content for demographic identities. And what that means is that space is centralized. Now, if you imagine what effect, this is like documented in academic studies of human technology interfaces, but television, radio, they brought people together into enclosed spaces and actually pulled people out of the street and into living rooms, into places where there were television. So they centralize space, and they provide programmed content, meaning the content is created in specific blocks of time. There are programs within the content. There are structures within the content. So archetypes like the news anchor, the authoritative male news anchor, who's a kind of beloved paternal figure who defines reality, or the nuclear family structure as portrayed on a sitcom, or the wisecracking, tuxedoed late night comedian. These are archetypes that provide a kind of identity within the content, but these also become structures themselves. And the identities that are produced are demographic, and I'll show you why demography is the structuring principle of identity in broadcast media. So Nielsen ratings were the first kind of way that media began to sense its users. So the corporations, the systems themselves began to try to understand who the users were, who the listeners and the viewers were, and to understand them, to sense into their identities. But this is how identity is structured. So the first market research is performed in 1923. In 1936, Nielsen creates a technology for monitoring user behavior, for consumer surveillance, looking at what channels of the radio are being listened to at what times. About 10 years later, the Consumer Index debuts, and they produce, they launch ratings based on the odometer, but they also begin to add this to television. So this is a relatively recent demographic breakdown of media use, but as you can see, they're divided by age, they're divided by gender, sometimes by location, and these are really crude, rough blocks within which the media begin to determine who is consuming it. The alternative that was proposed by the Committee for National Morale, sort of surround democratic or immersive media, was based on the idea of a distributed field of media. So as you'll see in some of the examples, the kind of things that we experience as immersive media would have their precedence in this form. The content is an experience, so people go to this event, they are immersed in this kind of medium, and through the way they navigate within that, this surround field of images and sounds, they construct an experience, and this constructed experience is, in theory, productive of a democratic identity. So the idea is that you have an array of choices, and you make those, rather than being told what to think, you're given options, and you kind of create your own reality within this set of images, sounds, and media. And the thing to understand about that is that this is, of course, a limited set of choices, right? This is false choice, or it's consumer choice, or it's a subset. But at the time, this would have felt revolutionary. So it's a distributed space providing experience for constructing identity. This is Herbert Bayer's diagram of 360-degree field of vision. Herbert Bayer had this notion that perspective had actually changed since the Renaissance, and that dynamism was the new relevant form of perspective. And so moving through a space and making decisions about where to look was more dynamic. This has echoes of cubism and futurism and quantum physics. This is an example of that display mechanism in action. And Herbert Bayer's Airways to Peace exhibition also begins to use the surround architecture for displaying. Now this is really interesting because this is a map of the Earth, and this is a kind of narrating how international air travel is going to bring about peace. It's almost a neoliberal kind of message foreshadowed here. And it's one of the first times that we see this enclosure, this spherical enclosure. It's ironic that it's the world, but it's turned inside out, and it's a military industrial representation of that. This is Edward Seiken's Family of Man exhibition, utilizing the same display technology of distributing things around. Of course, the salon in the 19th century had this, but this is formulated in a kind of different way, formulated in a post-Fordist way against the modernist exhibition of single images on the wall. And then Buckminster Fuller produces the geodesic dome for the Milan Architectural Triennial in 1954, and that gets picked up by not only the International World's Fairs, which are a kind of American propaganda effort around the world to expose people to what a democratic subject should look like, but also, I guess, to promote, our infrastructure as well. Like the freeways are a big, show up a lot, and this is a Charles Ray Eames film about cars and freeways. And then this dome structure gets reappropriated by the counterculture. So this is Drop City from 1960, a kind of artist movement that was sort of Midwestern Fluxus type of art movement that created this utopian city in southern Colorado. And then, of course, these surround experiences, these immersive kind of experiences like Fluxus, happenings, Alan Capro, this kind of mid-century early conceptualism. And all of this was also picked up by the counterculture. And so we have the Merry Pranksters, the laser light shows. This is Movie Drone by Stan Vanderbeek, which is a bunch of projections inside of a dome. Stan Vanderbeek was a Bell Labs employee. And the Trips festivals and this kind of iconic psychedelic oil projections. And this, of course, dovetails with the counterculture in the Bay Area, the whole Earth catalog, the sort of access to tools ideology of like make technology, make things for people to be autonomous, this kind of like libertarian hippie vibe that influences things like the Homebrew Computer Club, which then gives rise to Apple and Silicon Valley in general. Burning Man is a continuation of this immersive method, this immersive ideology, as is the kind of full projection-based 360 types of artworks like these by Team Lab, or the Sphere in Las Vegas, which we've already seen a couple times today, I think. Or the Apple Vision Pro and VR in general. I think what we're seeing is actually that this immersive dome, right, what starts as an enclosure and a sort of projection of different imagery around the viewer explodes almost like a fruiting body of a mushroom, and you get, you get media everywhere, right? So we're kind of living in the explosion of the immersive environment. The immersive environment is kind of splattered all around us, and everywhere you look, there's little screens in the backseat of the car and stuff like that. So, let's get into the next phase. And the way I've kind of described these is as overlapping layers or overlapping phases of media that kind of emerge out of each other. And so just as the immersive paradigm takes the individual channel of media and spreads it around and creates multiple channels, The immersive paradigm gives rise to the network paradigm by giving birth to Silicon Valley. And so it's established in the 80s, and the network is decentralized, also circulatory is another way of framing it. The content of network media is mimetic, or memes. We've kind of finally seen the full emergence of the true internet native format in the meme, and the identity that's constructed is a fractal identity. So again, this is a circulatory space, a decentralized space for mimetic content and fractal identities. This is the visualization of the structure of the internet by the Internet Mapping Project, and I think that the thing that's worth noting here is the circulatory nature of it. Obviously, it's kind of biomimetic. It looks like a circulatory system in a body, and as you're looking at this, and maybe later when we're thinking about neural media, it's good to notice that we, as users, exist at the nodal points in this diagram. Like, we are the ones that are responsible for circulating the content. Like, our actions as users are to exist in the network and to circulate the content of the network. We're not operating over the top of it, we're operating inside of it. We're functionally part of it. So again, the mushroom has burst, the spores are everywhere, the surround is all around us, and it's a little bit out of control. One thing I think you'll see if looking at immersive media is that it wove back and forth between the counterculture and utopian uses and more bureaucratic uses or propagandistic uses, right? So something that becomes a national signature of this dome and this utopian shape can also be borrowed by the counterculture, for example in Drop City, but then it also comes back fully counterculturally. The Grateful Dead sphere image was a really good expression of that, where that surround that started as a really raw underground thing maybe, or even maybe it wasn't. Maybe it started as something that was seeded by the government or by technocratic institutions like Bell Labs, gets appropriated, it becomes identified with the counterculture, and then that counterculture ascends to become the new dominant media paradigm, like we saw with the sphere. So memes come from Richard Dawkins' idea. He means it in terms of ideas or actions that are copied, mimetic. One person does another thing, one person does something, other people see it, they copy it. That's what a meme is. We've kind of literalized it by making it into an image text macro. But in terms of how memes influence identity, which is what I'm interested in here, because the meme is essentially the most naturally resonant form of media to exist inside of a network environment, right? It allows us to change, slowly evolve the meaning of things. They kind of rise and fall in popularity. But what does that have to do with identity? Well, I think the best possible example of that is the political compass meme, because this is where we do situate a lot of our personal and political identity, and this has become a meme space in its own right. So, it becomes a kind of board on which you can locate yourself, but also maneuver. Some of this, this is a iterative process. So when I say identity is fractal in a network media environment, what I mean is that we find deeper and deeper layers through an iterative process of refining our own identification and our own circulation of content, our own branding online. We find these narrow and narrow niches in which to identify ourselves, and this is a kind of fractal process where we might find ourselves at one end of a fractal occupying a shape that looks a bit similar to the thing that's on the other side of the horseshoe. And of course, it goes beyond just identity, and it becomes fully encompassing of reality, meaning that we don't only choose to iterate and refine our understanding of ourselves, but our understanding of reality becomes iterated and refined by burrowing deeper and deeper into media narratives and into offshoots of the fractal. And this was just a really entertaining slide, so I thought I would give you the full view. And this kind of iterative process, right, it takes you deeper and deeper into these contexts of understanding where you can't even really know what they're talking about unless you've gone down the rabbit hole. So this brings us to the medium that I'm calling neural media. And this is really something that we're now getting a taste of, but has been germinating since the early 2000s. We can get into the reasons for that, but in terms of these characteristics that I've described here, the space of neural media is high dimensional, and this has to do with the nature of the models themselves, the nature of AI, and its math, its underlying math. The content is hallucinated, and that has multiple meanings, but in the case of AI, it's, it is generated from within the model, and the identities are embedded. So we'll give a little bit of an explanation of what it means for something to be high dimensional. But to summarize, neural media is a high dimensional space with hallucinated content that generates embedded identities. And I'm going back to this image again because, as I described earlier, each of these phases of media seem to carry the future versions of future media within themselves, meaning they emerge out from within each other. Broadcast media gives rise to immersive media, gives rise to network media through the ways that it influences culture. Or another way of putting that is in Marshall McLuhan's phrasing, the content of every medium is the previous medium. So what is the content? Literally, what is the content of AI? It's the internet. That's the training data. So we're seeing the most literal expression of this McLuhan-esque formulation, or this McLuhan's formulation here, in the sense that when AIs are trained, they're trained on as much data as you can scrape from the internet. But the interesting thing to note is whereas within network media, we operate as individual nodes circulating content mimetically, within neural media, we're operating outside of that model that's trained on the entire internet. We now are interacting with the entire model at once rather than being circulatory nodes within it. Now, this is not an either or. We are both in a network media environment and a neural media environment, and those are transitioning. So we're seeing how they interact right now with the circulation of things like AI slop and the way that certain generative patterns feed into networks themselves. But the distinction here is if we're gonna make this, and again, this framework is to a large degree arbitrary, right? It's based on a specific history, and I'm trying to narrate it by smoothing over the corners and making it a little more digestible and linear. But I think the phase shift here is we go from being inside the network to being outside the network, or maybe inside and outside the network at once. These networks are biologically inspired. So if we go back to the origins of AI, this is Santiago Ramon y Cajal's cell stainings of human neural tissue. And this was the first time that we saw these neural patterns, these architectures in the human brain. This is McCulloch and Pitt's 1943 formulation of a neural computational process. So this is, about 50 years after we saw it, we had math for it. This is Alan Turing's perceptron, simple neural net computational structure. And this is an illustration of dimensionality. So when I say that the space of AI and neural media is high dimensional, what I mean is the actual mathematics of it revolve around high dimensional mathematical structures. So, just for example, a line would be one dimension, a line is one dimension, a plane is two dimensions, and a cube is three dimensions. So within each of those, there are more and more locatable spaces or separable spaces, right? So the more dimensions you have, the more positions you have. We can imagine more than three dimensions, even though it gets a little bit difficult for us. This is a drawing by an artist of a 12-dimensional structure. And just visually, there's quite a bit of similarity with the neural net imagery that we're seeing before, but also there are a lot of ways to organize this space. This is a diagram of a neural net. Other diagrams showing some of the processes and how these layers and layers of dimensionalities stack up. I won't get too into the weeds with it, just in the interest of time. But this is called MNIST. data set, it's clustering. And so the important point here is that when you work in this high dimensional space, you need to visualize it in a lower dimensional space, and using dimensionality reduction, you're able to see similarities within a data set. So this MNIST is kind of a canonical data set in AI and in machine learning, and you can see how the system is classifying these handwritten digits and finding ones that are kind of similar and maybe placing them close to each other, like the 3s and the 8s and the 5s down here in the lower right. But this has all been done in a high dimensional space and then flattened down to a viewable 2D plane for us to visualize. That similarly, this image is also generated from within that space and has a very alien quality because of it. And then when it comes to hallucination, I mean, like actually go back to this. The idea that the content of AI is fundamentally hallucinated comes from this process that we've seen with early AI and with new now diffusion models and things like this, where we generate images from within the neural net. So the neural net is feeding back on itself and generating an image. And this is akin to a hallucinatory process in a human brain where we might see something internally that is projected into reality, this same process. And so when is happening with generative AI, and this is what we call hallucination. So if we're looking for a fundamental quality of the systems in relation to their content, we could definitely say that they are hallucinated. And the question then becomes, what kind of subjectivity, what kind of subject is produced in that process of engaging with the hallucinations, in the process of engaging with neural media. And again, where I'm speaking a lot about AI here, but I've kind of left the door open for this to be anything that relates to neural structures in media. And the reason I think that's important to kind of make that distinction is because if you look back, broadcast media was looking at crude demographic blocks. Immersive media was giving users an array of images from which to construct a sort of limited number of permutations for themselves, based on this idea that that would be promoting democracy. Network media is creating an infinite range of fractal rabbit holes that we can go down in terms of our mimetic understanding of culture, of ourselves, of reality. And neural media is now putting us into relationship with a medium that is constantly modeling us. So, I mean, we didn't get much into the history of integrating AI technologies into user interfaces, but that really did happen with e-commerce and modeling user behavior for the purpose of suggesting products. And so this is when you start to get a really high dimensional mapping of the individual users, and the subject that's being modeled by the system itself in the form of broadcast media was very crude. It was your age, your gender, maybe where you lived, with these kind of user modeling systems, with suggester systems, recommender systems in the 2010s on Amazon, Netflix, social media, we're starting to create a high dimensional model of the user, and the system is starting to sense back at us. And so this type of hallucinated content is in some sense part of that sensory mechanism where it's seeing how we react to different things, and it's driving us towards specific desired outcomes that the system has in mind. Same thing with this generated, there are all kinds of generated hallucinatory images, but also they're building up a pattern of understanding of what it is people want. A lot of it looks kind of the same in that way. And so we're getting these really different understandings of ourselves and these different distributions of ourselves. The next piece for Gropius Bao is going to talk a little bit about the midpoint of the bell curve and the notion of kind of content distribution and aesthetics around that. But one of the things I want to just put up for discussion or for thinking is the experience of talking with a chatbot and some of the psychological effects. I think because we're in a very early stage of this process, we haven't really come to terms with what it means or what it feels like, what the implications are for our sense of ourselves when we do have these conversations. And so there is a certain amount of shock involved, and I call it an ontological shock, because it kind of shakes our ideas about ourselves and about what it means to use language or what it means to sort of have a generative capacity. So we can look at some of the examples of the last couple of years. Blake Lemoine at Google, Kevin Roos, the New York Times journalist, and his conversations with AI, some of these early phases of people encountering language models and their ability to generate text in a human-like manner produces, in my perception, one of two things. We are either tempted to see the model as a self because it convincingly performs a type of selfhood, a certain type of understanding of itself. It expresses desires, it seems to have motivations, it's consistent in its use of language. And in that sense, we have to ask ourselves, is the model conscious? Does the model have a self? The other end of the spectrum I've seen is the idea that in encountering these things, we begin to think of ourselves as models. So if the AI is using language in a human-like way, and that's how I distinguish my difference from other kinds of beings, that's what makes me human, then might I also just be a model if that's really all that this boils down to. I don't think these are sufficient. And when I spoke about embedded identity, I was speaking about this notion of high dimensional space and us being modeled within it by the systems. So if Netflix or Amazon thinks of me in a certain way, that becomes a kind of embedding within the high dimensional space of their AI model. And that becomes a type of identity that's assigned to me. And I can respond to that, I can be interpolated by that, by the ways that I interact with the system. This is a classic example of how embeddings work. In the interest of time, I'm not gonna go too deeply into it, but what I think neural media is offering us is a more high resolution way of being sensed by the media that we interact with. So broadcast media was quite crude, and it was in some ways motivated by very clear governance and political concerns. AI, as it's being developed now, is very commercial, it's very high dimensional and detailed, but the ways that we're being called forth as subjects, the ways we're being interpolated are different. And so I'm hoping that we'll see the same dynamics of movement, appropriation of media types that we saw with immersive media, movement back and forth between the stakeholders within that space, evolution of the terminologies, evolution of the medium itself. New open source projects seem to point to that being more of a possibility than it was before, but these are also very expensive things to produce. So if we're thinking about our relation to these systems and the way that they structure our identities, perhaps we can appropriate some of that language now and think about our embeddedness, not just in digital systems that might model our bodies and create even more refined and detailed maps of who we are and time sequence data about who we are, but that we might find ourselves in a different kind of embedding more broadly, as instead of seeing ourselves through the lens of broadcast media and crude age and gender demographics, or in sort of fractal political formations, might we see ourselves as part of these larger constructs of perception and understanding in a high dimensional way. There's a positive possibility there, but I think what I've seen in this research is that all of these systems and all of the ways that they influence us to become a certain kind of subject are always heavily politically motivated and embody conflicting forces. It's not a simple cut and dry psyop. There's a lot going on, and so I'm just gonna leave it with that. Thank you.